Jeremy Clarkson spent 50 years mocking everything that wasn't a V8 engine or a proper English bitter. He built a £75 million brewing empire by accident. And Carlsberg, one of the largest beer companies on the planet, offered him £50 million to buy it. He said no before the day was out. This was never a celebrity cashing a check. This is the story British brewing didn't ask for, couldn't have predicted, and still can't quite explain away. Every good story about Jeremy Clarkson starts the same way. He's standing in the middle of a disaster he has personally caused, and he looks, against all reasonable expectation, entirely pleased about it. This one is no exception. It might be the purest version of the pattern in his entire career. It's 2020, Diddley Squat Farm, just outside Chipping Norton, tucked into that particular fold of the Cotswolds where the dry stone walls look like they've been there since the argument with Rome and never saw any reason to leave. Clarkson has just brought in his first serious barley harvest, 1,000 acres of it, and there is nowhere for it to go. The grain merchants looked at the invoice, saw a television presenter's name at the top, and lost interest before they'd finished reading it. Not entirely unfairly, given the evidence available at the time. The prices they bothered quoting wouldn't have covered the diesel, let alone the seed, let alone the season of quiet optimism he'd already sunk into the ground alongside it. Caleb Cooper, who had been working this particular land since long before Clarkson arrived and has never once considered living anywhere else, delivered the verdict without ceremony or padding. They were going to lose money on every single ton they carted off the field. There wasn't a clever way around it. There was just the fact of it standing in the yard between them. For most people, that's the moment you write it off, call it a tax loss, and go back to what you know. Clarkson would freely admit he is rarely accused of being most people. He'd been drinking bitter for 50 years. The real kind. The kind his father drank at the end of a working day without needing to explain why or dress it up for anyone. The kind that had been quietly disappearing from pub taps all across the country, replaced by fizzy imports with names that sounded like Scandinavian. Furniture assembled with instructions that turned out to be for something else entirely. Standing in a shed that smelled of diesel and damp straw, surrounded by grain the industry didn't want, he had the sort of idea that only makes proper sense in hindsight. He'd brew it himself. He'd work out the details afterwards. He nearly always does. It very much was not simple, and everyone involved understood that from the first conversation. He went, and here is one of those moments where Clarkson does the sensible thing, usually by arriving at it sideways, to people who actually knew what they were doing. Rick King had been a professional brewer for over 2 decades. Emma King had spent those same years building the business around him, one unglamorous batch at a time, turning the Cotswold Brewing Company into something real through the kind of patient, unspectacular craft that never once makes the papers but shows up every time someone opens the bottle. Between them, they built something with no fanfare whatsoever and no audience beyond the people who'd found it and kept coming back. What they didn't have was a 62-year-old, with the most watched original series on Amazon Prime and an audience that would have followed him into a burning building if he'd asked them, nicely, and pointed a camera at the door. Clarkson bought in properly. And in 2021, 2 very different kinds of expertise, decades of quiet brewing knowledge on one side, an audience built on trust on the other, became a single operation with a single name. They didn't call it something clever. No wordplay. No consultant flown up from London with 3 options and a slide deck. They named it Hawkstone after a Neolithic standing stone on land near the farm. 4,000 years old? Already ancient when Rome was still mapping the roads. It had watched legions and Normans and plagues and punk rock arrive and pass without raising anything resembling an eyebrow. It's the kind of name that only makes sense once you understand this was never purely about beer. It was about something that had simply been standing there the whole time, patient, unimpressed by trends, waiting for someone to notice it again and give it a reason to matter. The launch came in October 2020, and by every conceivable law of business, it should have been a quiet catastrophe. Pubs shuttered. The entire trade on its knees. Landlords wondering if they'd see the other side of it. Who launches a premium beer in a pandemic when the places that have always sold beer can't open their doors? Here is the thing the big breweries had entirely missed. People were at home. The holiday money had nowhere to go. And they were looking, quietly and without quite being able to say it out loud, for something that felt like it meant something. Not another supermarket lager reached for out of pure habit. Something with a reason behind it. You know that feeling. Most of us do. The thing you buy not because it's cheap, but because buying it feels like a small act of choosing something real over something convenient. That is precisely what Hawkstone arrived into. And it sold out within 8 hours. #1 selling beer on Amazon across the entire country. Outselling Budweiser. Outselling Corona. Outselling Stella, 3 brands with marketing budgets Clarkson's operation couldn't have matched in its first 5 years combined. The team seriously discussed rationing bottles before Christmas, genuinely worried the first run might be gone before the shelves. Needed restocking? Now, here is the part that is easy to speed past and shouldn't be. That first year didn't happen because of a famous face on a label. It happened because the beer was genuinely good. Full stop. Rick King's 20 years of craft did the real work long before Clarkson's name did anything beyond persuading someone to try the first bottle. The second bottle, and the third, and the 1,000 after that, those were earned in the glass. Every other celebrity drinks brand in this country follows the same script so reliably you could teach it in business school. Famous face. Existing conglomerate doing the actual work behind a curtain nobody is invited to look behind. Famous face turns up to the launch, collects the check, and moves along. It's licensing dressed as entrepreneurship, and the industry has a well-worn playbook for what comes next. Wait until it's big enough to matter. Buy it, fold it into the supply chain, and stop asking where the barley actually comes from. Hawkstone refused the script at every single step. The barley in every bottle is grown on diddly squat, and on neighboring farms a handful of miles from the brewery itself. Close enough that you could walk the delivery route on a decent afternoon. Not shipped from wherever happens to be cheapest that quarter. Grown in Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire by farmers who had worked that particular fold of England for generations and who, for the first time in a considerable while, had a buyer who would pay a fair price every harvest, regardless of what the commodity markets or the weather or the war in Ukraine happened to be doing that week. It costs considerably more to produce this way. That, rather pointedly, was always the entire idea, because this was also a direct argument against something the big breweries had been quietly selling for decades. The idea that Britain simply couldn't make proper lager. Not really. Not the kind worth boasting about. Lager was German business, Czech business, Danish business. Britain did bitter and did it beautifully and was otherwise encouraged to mind its own postcode. The big breweries were rather fond of this particular myth since it let them brew cheap industrial lager under continental-sounding names and charge, accordingly, without anyone looking too closely at the label. Clarkson looked at that received wisdom and did what he does best. He ignored it completely. And it turned out that British barley, malted and brewed properly by people who genuinely cared how the finished pint tasted, produced something clean, crisp, and confident enough to stand next to Peroni or Estrella without apologizing for where it came from or what it cost. No story about Clarkson is complete without the catastrophe he causes himself. This one nearly ended everything before the brand had properly found its footing. Summer of 2023, a batch of Hawkstone cider, made from actual cider apples grown in the Vale of Evesham and the Cotswolds. Not eating apples dosed with sugar water and colored to look convincing on a shelf, began fermenting again after it had already been bottled. Capped and dispatched to shops across the country, the pressure had nowhere left to go. Some bottles exploded. On shop shelves. In kitchens. In front rooms. Several customers got the fright of their lives over what was supposed to be a quiet drink on a summer afternoon. Most companies in that position go quiet. The recall goes through official channels. The social media team monitors in silence and hopes it passes. Clarkson went straight online and told several 100,000 people that there had been, in his own words, a massive mistake. Here was the batch code. If you have a bottle, open it underwater. Pour it away. Contact them for a full refund. He apologized without a single lawyer's fingerprint visible on the wording. No careful hedging. No passive voice. No, we take this matter extremely seriously. Just, we got it wrong. Here is exactly what to do. We're sorry. Sales went up. In the weeks immediately following one of the most public product recalls the British drinks industry had seen. The crisis communications consultants of Britain presumably stared at that particular data point in complete silence for some time. It turns out British consumers, given the honest choice between polished corporate silence and a straightforward admission from a man who clearly cannot be bothered to pretend otherwise, will choose the honesty every single time and reward it generously with their continued custom. The instinct for spin had become so universal that the absence of it read as something close to revolutionary. By 2025, Hawkstone had posted sales north of £21 million, very nearly tripling the year before. 134% annual growth. The 23rd fastest growing private company in the entire country, brewery or otherwise. On shelves in Waitrose, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, and Tesco, poured in over 2,000 pubs from one end of the country to the other. And at the World Beer Awards in 2025, the Hawkstone IPA won gold in its category, praised specifically for its clean finish, its subtle fruit, its malted grain depth. Judges tasting blind have no idea whose barley went into the mash. They couldn't care less whose name is on the label. You cannot buy that particular result with a television contract. Then came the offer. Carlsberg, privately, directly, reportedly came in at around £50 million. Clarkson turned it down within 24 hours. Not because the number wasn't serious money. It was The sort of figure most people would need a week simply to hold in their heads properly. But because the offer had a flaw that no amount of money could fix, you cannot buy Hawkstone without buying the entire model that makes it work. Strip out the local barley, the transparent supply chain, the actual farmers who plan their year around a guaranteed buyer, and what you have left is just another lager with a famous name on the can. Indistinguishable, in the end, from Carling wearing a slightly better jacket and hoping nobody looks too closely at the ingredients. Carlsberg, in declining to understand this, managed to produce the most persuasive endorsement of the Hawkstone model ever written. They confirmed, with a £50 million offer, that the brand was worth buying. Clarkson confirmed by turning it down before the day was out, exactly why it wasn't for sale. There was also an advertising campaign. Farmers singing an enthusiastic and thoroughly unambiguous endorsement of the product's quality. The Advertising Standards Authority banned it. Within days, over 1 million people had gone looking for it specifically to see what the fuss was about. Rather more attention than the advert would ever have earned by being quietly approved and broadcast in the usual way. One suspects Clarkson understood precisely what he was doing when he signed off on it. The brewery now employs 53 people, the overwhelming majority of them local, drawn from villages that had been watching younger generations drift toward Oxford and London for want of anything worth staying for. It has expanded 3 times in 4 years. Its valuation has climbed past £75 million, entirely separate from the farm itself, which sits around £45 million in its own right. 2 distinct businesses quietly feeding each other in ways that are genuinely difficult to unpick. The farm grows the barley. The brewery turns it into something worth drinking. The television show, whether Clarkson fully intends it as advertising, or simply cannot help himself given that the cameras are always rolling anyway, delivers the whole enterprise into millions of living rooms every year at no cost whatsoever, better than any budget could buy. Talk to Clarkson about the money and he changes the subject. Toward the barley farmers who finally have a reliable buyer, year after year, regardless of what the season does to them. Toward the 53 people collecting a steady wage from the brewery floor. Toward the pubs that have found something worth putting on the bar that isn't simply the same 4 industrial lagers everyone else stocks without a second thought. The profit is entirely real. But it was always, if you look closely enough past the headlines, a means to a more old-fashioned end. Keeping British farming viable when subsidies dry up and government attention drifts elsewhere. Keeping a rural community in Oxfordshire employed and functioning rather than slowly hollowed out. And proving, rather inconveniently for a great many marketing departments, that you can build something thoroughly modern on values that aren't remotely fashionable. He's shown that British consumers will pay more for something honest, as long as you're straight with them about why it costs what it costs. He's shown that a celebrity name doesn't have to mean a hollow product forgotten within a year. He's turned a shed full of unwanted barley into one of the more genuinely important business stories in modern British brewing. And he's done it while being, by his own cheerful admission, entirely unqualified to do any of it when he started, and learning most of it as he went, in front of a camera, in a field in the Cotswolds, surrounded by grain the industry didn't want, love him or loathe him, and this country remains almost constitutionally divided on that particular question. It's rather hard to argue with the barley still growing in the ground, the 53 wages still being paid every month, and the £50 million he turned down on principle when a lesser man would have signed before lunch. Not a licensing deal, not a cash grab. A real thing built by refusing to accept no from an industry that dismissed him twice, and standing rather unbothered like a certain Neolithic stone nearby, while everyone who said it wouldn't work works out where it went wrong. If that story landed the way it deserved to, tell me in the comments what surprised you most. Was it the exploding cider? The £50 million turned down before dinner? Or the fact that the beer, against all reasonable expectation, is genuinely rather good in its own right? Subscribe if you haven't already, there's another story waiting, and I rather think you'll want to know where this one leads next.